At 3:45 hours local time at secret launch sites in Odessa, Ukrainian UAV crews were preparing for a key strike aimed directly at Saki Air Base, a target 190 miles away on the Crimean Peninsula. Saki is the base of the 43rd Naval Attack Aviation Regiment of the Black Sea Fleet, where Russia stations Su-24 bombers and Su-30 fighters. More importantly, it is also a vital link in Russia's air power network for protecting the skies over Crimea. In just 1 hour, Ukraine would make sure those Russian fighters would never take off again. And ironically, what would set the warplanes Russia had always proudly called among the best in the world on fire was nothing more than Ukraine's cheap UAVs at exactly 0:52 hours local time. The commander of the UAV control crew gave the order to launch the AN-196 Lyutiy from a camouflaged runway. The first aircraft took off at 50 miles per hour, then quickly accelerated to 110 miles per hour to stabilize after leaving the ground. Every 30 seconds, the remaining 24 Lyutyys continued accelerating and taking off toward the southeast, where Russia's Su-24s and Su-30s were parked waiting for bombing missions. Once the launch phase was complete, the control crews immediately withdrew quickly along secret roads in the darkness, shut off all lighting systems, and activated thermal sensor blocking measures. They understood very clearly that in just 1 minute, once Russia detected these unusual signals, the launch area would immediately be struck by Russian artillery, missiles, or suicide reconnaissance UAVs at the same time. The 25 AN-196 Lyutiy had dropped to an altitude of 240 feet above the sea and were racing southeast. They quietly followed the darkness of the Black Sea like small black dots, crawling beneath the eyes of the entire Crimean air defense network. On Russian radar screens, only a few very weak signals appeared, flickered, and then disappeared near the radar horizon. But that very abnormality immediately caught the attention of the Russian duty crew. Too slow to be cruise missiles, too low to be fighter jets, and with a radar cross-section too small to immediately confirm as real targets. Only seconds later, the warning signal was transferred into Crimea's air defense network. Target data was quickly pushed to the S-400 Triumph system positioned in Sevastopol, the long-range defensive layer Russia believed was strong enough to lock down the skies over western Crimea, in theory. The S-400 was an almost impenetrable air defense fortress. The 91N6E Big Bird surveillance radar could search for targets from very long distances. The 92N6E fire control radar could track multiple targets at the same time. And the interceptors inside the vertical launch tubes could reach out to 300 miles. The 48N6E3 missiles in those vertical launch tubes could reach up to 150 miles and intercept targets at an altitude of 100,000 feet. With a system like that, Russian officers believed Ukrainian UAVs should have been shot down at the outer edge of Crimea. But the battlefield does not operate according to advertised numbers on paper. It operates according to the curvature of the Earth, ground clutter, sea surface reflections, and every second of human reaction time. At an altitude of only 240 feet above the sea, the Lyutiy almost turned the radar horizon into a natural shield. A ground-based radar can be extremely powerful when looking up into the high sky, but it struggles when searching for small targets skimming just above the sea surface. Every wave, every strip of low land, every coastal structure, and every reflected signal can turn the radar screen into a chaotic field of clutter. It is like a soldier looking up to find aircraft in the sky, while the real threat is crawling close to the ground right beneath his feet. The S-400's X-band fire control radar, operating in the 8 to 12 GHz range, is extremely effective at tracking fighter aircraft at high altitude. But the problem was that the 25 Lyutiy were not flying as one mass. They spread out into multiple small approach directions, forcing Russian radar to distinguish which signals were real UAVs, which were background clutter, and which were only false returns created by the terrain. Every second of hesitation shortened the distance between the UAV formation and Saki. The next defensive layer was Buk M3, a system used not only to intercept medium-range targets, but also to shield the S-400 Triumph itself when threats slipped inside the long-range defensive zone. Buk M3's 9S36 radar could support detection and guidance against low-flying targets, while its 9M3 missile could intercept targets at ranges of up to 40 miles. But in this situation, the problem was no longer range, the problem was time. From the moment the UAV signal became clear on the screen to the moment the missile left the launcher, the Russian combat crew still needed at least 6 seconds to receive the radar signal, identify the target, transfer the data, rotate the launcher, and give the firing order. That may sound very short, but against a low-flying target closing in at 110 miles per hour, those few seconds could become a matter of survival. The Ukrainian UAVs could cover 1.2 miles in only 40 seconds. If Buk M3 only saw the target clearly when it was already very close, the real reaction window was almost choked shut. The missile still had range, the radar was still operating. The combat crew was still sitting in front of the screen. But everything was happening too close, too low, and too fast for the system to respond the way it was drawn on the operational map. That was exactly what Ukraine was aiming for. They only needed to push it into a situation where a delay of just a few seconds was enough to tear open the entire defensive layer in front of Saki. And by then, everything was already too late. At 04:48 hours local time, the first 8 AN-196 Lyutiy slipped through the final defensive layer in western Crimea and raced straight into the radar area, protecting the approach to Saki. The first explosions tore through the air defense position near Sevastopol. The 92N6E fire control radar, the command vehicle, and the support equipment around it were swallowed by a column of fire. A system designed to control the sky from hundreds of miles away had now been knocked down at exactly its most vulnerable point, the final few miles before the target. Once the most important link of the S-400 was broken, the remaining Lyutiy immediately shifted to the second target, the Su-24 and Su-30 parking area at Saki Air Base. These were the aircraft Russia used to maintain pressure over the Black Sea and threaten Ukraine's defensive lines in the south. But when they were sitting motionless on the ground, they were no longer symbols of air power. They were only large blocks of metal filled with fuel, ammunition and electronics, almost impossible to hide from electro-optical sensors. Within minutes, the aircraft parking area began to burn. Fuel trucks, maintenance equipment and auxiliary compartments around the Su-24s and Su-30s detonated in a chain reaction. For Ukraine, this was not only a strike on a few aircraft, it was a strike on Russia's ability to sustain air attacks across the entire Crimean direction. And that was only the first part of the attack. By 04:52 hours local time, as black smoke was still rising from the S-400 radar area, the next wave of Lyutiy pushed deeper into Saki. At this point, Russian Buk M3 crews tried to fill the gap the S-400 had just left behind. 9M3 missiles left their launchers and raced into the low sky at supersonic speed. But the problem was no longer how fast the missiles could fly. The problem was whether they still had enough time to lock onto the right targets. The Ukrainian UAVs did not rush in along one single path. They split into multiple small directions, forcing Russian radar to keep switching tracks, classifying targets, and setting priorities. Some signals appeared and then vanished behind the terrain background. Others showed up for only a few seconds before dropping close to the sea surface. For the Russian operators, every delayed decision meant another. Lyutiy had moved closer to the aircraft parking area. Buk M3 began firing continuously. 9M3 missiles left their launchers and dived into the low airspace in front of Saki at Mach 3.8. Their proximity fuses were set to detonate within 15 feet of the target, but under these conditions, flying close was not enough. 4 missiles flashed past the Lyutiy formation, but failed to create a fragment cloud dense enough to tear the UAVs apart. 2 others were pulled off by reflections from the sea surface, low terrain, smoke from the S-400 site that had just been hit, and metal structures around the airfield. Buk M3 was still firing, but every shot was like throwing a spear into a grey curtain that kept shifting. Meanwhile, the thermal sensors of the AN-196 Lyutiy saw Saki airbase in a completely different way. Against the cold pre-dawn background, every heat source stood out. Fuel trucks, recently active engines, electrical equipment clusters, maintenance zones, and the Su-24s and Su-30s sitting still on the parking apron. The UAVs selected their targets one by one. One struck the fuel truck area, another drove into a maintenance equipment cluster. The next ones aimed directly at the rows of Su-24s and Su-30s, where the aircraft were parked close enough for one explosion to trigger multiple secondary fires. When the Lyutiy warheads detonated, fire swept across the parking area like an orange wall. Fuel ignited, debris tore across the runway surface. One Su-24 caught fire along its fuselage, one Su-30 was pierced near the wing. The surrounding ground vehicles continued exploding, turning each small fire point into a spreading chain of flames. By die Fuhr für 57 hours local time, Saki airbase had become a sea of fire. Buk M3 had fired heavily, but it had brought down only 12 of the Lyutiy formation. The remaining 13 still punched through the final defensive layer and hit their targets. For Ukraine, that was enough. They did not need to destroy the entire Crimean air defense network. They only needed to make it a few seconds slower than the real battlefield. And those few seconds were enough to set Saki on fire. Sometimes what defeats an air defense system is not a more advanced weapon. It is numbers, tempo, and pressure pushed onto it all at once. After the S-400 position near Sevastopol was hit, Russia understood that a dangerous hole had been torn open in the western Crimea defensive layer. So, at 04:55 hours local time, all remaining systems around the Saki approach route were ordered to fire at maximum capacity. Buk M3 held the intermediate interception layer. Pole 21 began covering satellite signals and control channels with jamming. In the innermost ring, 2 SS-38 Derivatia systems had already turned their 57mm cannon barrels toward the low flight path, ready to create a dense fire layer in front of any target that broke through. On the operational map, it was still a terrifying air defense network, but in reality, that network had just lost its most important eye and was now facing a problem it was not designed to solve easily. Too many small targets appearing at the same time, the AN-196 Lyutiy did not rush in as one single formation. They split into multiple small groups, approaching from different angles, sometimes separating, sometimes crossing paths, sometimes merging back into the same direction. On Russian radar screens, the UAV formation no longer looked like 25 separate targets. It looked like a swarm of signals spilling through multiple gaps at once. The problem was no longer detecting one UAV. The problem was deciding which one was most dangerous, which one had to be fired at first, which one was only a decoy, and which one was racing straight toward the aircraft parking area. As soon as one track was created, the formation changed angle. As soon as one group was prioritized for interception, another had already slipped into a gap. The fire control computer was not defeated by one target that was too powerful. It was dragged into too many small decisions at the same time. In a desperate effort, the Pole 21 system intensified its jamming, trying to choke the UAV's navigation and communication signals. But the Lyutiy did not depend entirely on one single control source. They could still keep flying through inertial data, pre-programmed routes, and terminal phase self-correction. Even more ironically, the strongest jamming zone unintentionally pointed toward the place. Russia was trying hardest to protect. Where Pole 20 interference was thickest was often also where air defense positions, fuel depots, command vehicles, or active aircraft parking areas were located. Every cycle of detection, classification, target assignment, and fire preparation required time. But the Lyutiy formation did not wait for the Russian system to complete that calculation. With every short second, they kept moving closer to Saki, forcing air defense crews to fire faster, choose targets more hastily, and accept wider margins of error. When Buk M3 focused on one group, another shifted its approach direction. When Su S-830 Derivacja locked down one fire corridor, the UAVs behind it spread out. When radar tried to redistribute targets, the formation crossed paths again, forcing the system to calculate from the beginning, before the final Lyutiys rushed into the Su-24 and Su-30 parking area. The network protecting Saki had been forced to process too many directions, too many signals, and too many decisions at the same time. At 5:02 hours local time, when the AN-196 Lyutiy groups were still 14 miles from the main fuel depot area of Saki Air Base, Russian air defense began firing with everything it had left. The S-400 immediately launched 8 9M96E missiles and brought down 8 Lyutiys in the first firing sequence. Buk M3 continued by launching 8 9M317M missiles and shot down 7 more. When Pole 21 intensified its jamming at high power, 4 UAVs drifted out of formation and were removed from the final attack phase. In the innermost ring, 2 S-38 Derivacja systems poured 57 mm fire into the low sky, bringing down 4 more Lyutiys. Russia had intercepted most of the UAV formation. But after all those missile launches, electronic jamming, and dense walls of fire, enough Lyutiys still punched through the defensive layer and raced straight towards Saki's main fuel depot area. If the aircraft parking area was where Russia's air power could be seen, then the fuel depot was where that power was kept alive. At 4 hours local time, the 6 remaining Lyutiys rushed into the tank area and fuel supply routes from multiple angles. The first explosions tore through the concrete ground, threw ground vehicles into the air, and ruptured fuel pipelines. Only seconds later, small fire points began connecting into one long strip of flames. At 056 hours local time, the next wave struck the refueling vehicle area and support structures near the depot. Black smoke spread across the fuel zone, blocking the movement routes of fire trucks. Russia could claim it had intercepted most of Ukraine's UAVs, but on the ground, the main fuel depot, pumping lines, refueling trucks, auxiliary storage area, and support structures around the base were all burning. When the Russians thought this morning's attack was beginning to subside, Ukraine delivered the final blow against the airport operations building and Crimea's air defense system. At 05:08 hours local time, while the fire was still spreading through the main fuel area, Russia activated the final protective layer. The Krasuka-4 electronic warfare system began intensifying its jamming around the central area. But the AN-196 Lyutiy did not fly by one signal alone. They continued relying on inertial guidance, pre-programmed routes, electro-optical sensors, and terminal phase image recognition. Krasuka-4 could jam external signals, but it could not erase the real shape of Saki Air Base from the eyes of the sensors. Russia had prepared decoys around this area, but those misleading details were recognized very quickly and ignored. By around 05:09 hours local time, the jamming intensity around the operations area increased sharply, which itself unintentionally revealed the place Russia was trying hardest to shield. The Lyutiy began assigning targets among themselves. At 5:11 hours local time, the strike began. The UAVs carrying penetrating warheads drove into the hard points of the building. Others struck the auxiliary power station, command vehicles, antenna clusters, and backup generators around the concrete yard. Power cabinets, communication servers, control panels, encryption equipment, cables, and backup electrical systems began burning in a chain reaction. Communication channels between the airfield, air defense crews, and firefighting units fell into chaos. By 5:12 hours local time, the final strike was complete. The fuel depot was still burning. The aircraft parking area was still covered in smoke, and now the airport operations building and the remaining links of Crimea's air defense system had also been hit. Saki had lost the ability to coordinate its own rescue. Militarily, Ukraine had hit multiple critical links at the same time. At least 4 aircraft hangars at Saki were destroyed or heavily damaged. 2 launchers or components of the S-400 system were disabled. 2 Panzer S-1 systems in the Kerch Strait area were also hit. The attack also spread into coordination infrastructure. The main substation in Sevastopol, which distributes electricity from the Balaklava thermal power plant, was knocked out, causing a citywide blackout. Strategically, Ukraine was attacking the structure of Russia's defense in Crimea. Every weakened S-400 system, every Panzer S-1 removed from the fight, every fuel depot and power station hit tore another hole in the protective network around the peninsula. This was also clear proof of Ukraine's swarm warfare capability. The message to Moscow was very clear. Crimea is no longer an untouchable fortress. In the long run, Ukraine's goal is to turn Crimea from a solid Russian rear area into a region that is constantly threatened, constantly forced to patch holes, and constantly consuming resources just to protect itself. This campaign made the entire Crimean defense system gradually lose its ability to see, react, and protect itself. Thank you for watching until the end of the video. If you found this analysis useful, hit like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below. After this strike, do you think Russia will have to increase air defense in Crimea, disperse its aircraft, or take a long-term ceasefire?